Good evening, LifeBridge. I'm so glad you're able to join us again this evening as we continue on in this series that we've begun, Real Jesus, discovering the real Jesus of history. And today we'll be looking at a passage in the Gospel of Mark that speaks to the power of Jesus. And I got to tell you, it's an amazing thing when we discover not just the heart of Jesus, but his power as well. Now, I want you to picture yourself waiting in a checkout line that hasn't moved for 10 minutes. Many of us, I'm pretty sure, would feel pretty frustrated. Have you ever been late for an appointment? This is when it really gets me. And as you drive to get there, the car ahead of you is actually driving the speed limit. Think about that. Especially when they do this driving the speed limit thing on a stretch of road that you can't pass them on. Well, everybody struggles to some degree with impatience, I'm pretty sure. And that's because we're born with this trait. Think about a 3-month-old who wants milk in the middle of the night. The inborn reaction is to fuss at the first hint of discomfort and to keep at it until the need is met. Patterns you see from our old flesh nature make this a continual battle for most people. In fact, have you noticed that when you're in a situation that you're troubled over, or when there's a delay or a pressure on you, or something's not happening that you want to happen, there's always a temptation to come to the end of your patience. I think we all experience this to some degree or another. Now, while the old saying is true that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step, the facts are that the same journey doesn't end after the first step. Debbie and the kids and I learned this lesson when we hiked one of the mountains in the Rockies near Canmore, Alberta a few years ago. The 3,000-foot climb to the top of the 8,000-foot mountain is at once both inviting and challenging. It's inviting because of the amazing, breathtaking views, but it's also challenging because of the steep, steady, continuous climb, the occasional rocky outcrops that need to be navigated, and of course the bloodthirsty hordes of mosquitoes. Every step along the hike from start to finish was a blend of challenge and invitation, difficulty and pleasure. You know what? The journey of faith in Jesus is also a continuous blend of challenge and invitation. In Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 43, there was a synagogue leader that went by the name of Jairus, who went on such a step-by-step faith journey himself. You see, his 12-year-old daughter was critically ill. In fact, she was on the brink of dying. But along the way, he discovers the amazing power of Jesus. Now, perhaps he had heard about or even witnessed Jesus' healing power on a previous occasion or on a number of occasions. In any case, Jairus believed that if Jesus were to come to his daughter's side, she's going to be healed. But along this journey of discovering who Jesus really is, Jairus learned that patience was a reward that brought so much more than he expected. Well, let's just jump right into the story. We'll start at Mark chapter 5, and we're going to start at verse 21. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." Now, who's Jairus? Well, Jairus was a religious leader. He was a ruler in the synagogue. He would have been known as a man of great devotion to God in his community. He would have been morally respectable as well as a figure of wealth and social prominence. In other words, he was a man of authority and standing in the cultural circles that he was in at the time. Yet, here we see him falling at the feet of a Galilean carpenter. Now, if you understand the Galileans, they were viewed by most of the people within Israel as kind of the hillbillies of the day. They were the ones that they made jokes about in that little area of Galilee. And here he is falling at the feet of this Galilean carpenter. And so that must have been very hard for Jairus. After all, he's a ruler of the synagogue, where all of his colleagues disapprove of Jesus and had even closed their synagogues to him and his ministry. And he did this publicly. But desperate times calls for desperate measures. It must have taken a conscious effort of humiliation for this ruler of the synagogue to come and ask for help from Jesus. Nobody wants to be in somebody's debt on purpose. We like to run life on our own and on our own terms, don't we? But with Jairus, we see a man who swallowed his pride. Why? Because he recognizes that he needed Jesus. I mean, he couldn't handle the problems in his life on his own, and he needed a resource outside of himself to deal with the issue at hand. So fear of death, love for his daughter, and a sense of utter helplessness drove this man to Jesus. I mean, listen, tragedy doesn't care who you are. The trials of life aren't going to pass you by. Heartache doesn't care that you go to church and pay your tithes. Sickness and death could care less about your achievements and your possessions. When the trials of life come, you need a resource outside of yourself. When death, sickness, sorrow, marital problems, financial trouble, on and on and on come, you need more than some religion or the stuff of this world. You need a touch of faith that rests in Jesus and in his power, knowing that he has a perfectly timed plan. Jairus comes to Jesus and he gets straight to the point. And he says in verse 23, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. I mean, bottom line is his little girl is as good as dead. I mean, in fact, that's the language he uses. She's going to die unless Jesus comes. According to the Jewish custom, a girl became a woman at the age of 12 and 1 day. This girl was just on the threshold of womanhood. All the family's hopes and all their dreams for this little girl were crashing down around them. You see, by this point, she was most likely promised to a young man in marriage. Typically, at that time, a girl would be married by the age of 13, at the latest 14. Families were going to be joined in this case. All the hopes of her future, though, are now being dashed when death comes knocking at the door. So you can imagine Jairus' excitement when he realized there's hope for my dying daughter. Yet, I could still imagine that his insides must have been churning with fear that he and Jesus are going to be too late. So Jesus, Jairus, and the disciples hurry toward Jairus' home. Jairus is excited. They're finally on their way. And they're followed by a crowd of people eager to see another miracle. Well, let's continue on in verse 24 to 26. Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years, she had spent everything she had to pay them, but she had gotten no better. In fact, she'd gotten worse. Now, as Jesus and his disciples and Jairus are on their way to this urgent appointment, Jesus is stopped by a woman who touches him, and she gets healed. Now, we learned about that last week, if you remember. And if you recall, Jesus stops the entourage, this emergency procession, and he turns around and says, I got to find out who touched me. So I could just imagine Jairus' anxiety during all of this, and even the disciples' irritation. This woman with a chronic condition is getting the attention instead of the little girl with an acute condition. And even more to the point, Jesus chooses to stop and talk with a woman who's just been healed. I mean, it's one thing that she's healed, but she's healed. Let's move on. No, Jesus stops and talks to her. I mean, to Jairus, this stop of Jesus's makes no sense. It is absolutely irrational. In fact, it's probably even worse than that. In his mind, he's thinking it's malpractice. If these two women, these two girls were in the same emergency room, any doctor who treated the woman first and then let the little girl die would be sued. Jairus and the disciples got to be thinking, what are you doing? I mean, don't you understand the situation? I mean, hurry up, Jesus. In their minds, they're thinking that Jesus was just going to be too late. Now, there's a great line in the movie The Lord of the Rings. In this particular scene, Frodo was waiting under a tree for the wizard Gandalf. And when Gandalf finally arrives, Frodo says, "You're late." To which Gandalf replies, "A wizard is never late, nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to." You know what? That's how it is with God. God is never late, and nor is he early. God arrives precisely when, how, why, and where he intends to. Now, as Jesus is standing there and he's talking with the woman, the thing that Jairus feared all along happens. And the news is blunt and final. We find it in verse 35. Let me read it. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" I mean, they're saying, listen, Jairus, don't bother Jesus. Even he can't fix this problem. Your daughter's dead. It is what it is. Listen, have you ever been faced with a similar situation? I mean, the facts stare you in the face, and every one of them cries, "No hope." I mean, that must have been how Mary and Martha felt when Lazarus got sick and they sent for Jesus to come heal him. You can read about that in John chapter 11. When Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Actually stayed there long enough that Lazarus died before he was able to get there. They come tell Jesus, okay, fine, and then he waits. What they didn't know was that what seemed to be a delay was really setting the stage for a greater miracle. In fact, that may have been how Jairus and his group felt as well. They thought Jesus was not moving on time. Again, what they saw was as a delay was merely setting the stage for a greater miracle. We can't see what God is doing behind the scenes, church. Sometimes it appears that he's taking his time when we want him to move faster, but God has no need to explain himself to us. What we do need to know is that when God doesn't make sense, keep trusting him anyway. He's working in ways you can't see to accomplish what you can't imagine. God has a plan for your situation. Even when you can't see what God is doing, learn to trust him and in his impeccable timing anyway. Still, imagine how Jairus feels about Jesus at that moment. But Jesus looks at him calmly and he says in verse 36, "Do not fear, only believe." In essence, Jesus is saying to Jairus, trust me, just be patient. There's no need to hurry. God's sense of timing might often puzzle us, but he doesn't run on our schedule. He's not bound by the constraints of time and space. In fact, it might surprise you, but God doesn't wear a watch or even carry around a calendar. When Jesus looks at Jairus, he says, trust me, just be patient. In effect, I really believe that he's looking over Jairus' head at all of us, and he's saying, remember how I calmed the storm? And I showed you that my grace and love are more than enough for the storms, though you didn't think so, or you might not even think so. Well, now I'm telling you that my grace and my love are more than enough with what seems to you to be unacceptable delays in your life. Listen, Jesus will not be hurried. And as a result, we often feel exactly like Jairus, impatient, because he's delaying in our minds irrationally and what we may think is offensively. I would imagine that Jairus is confused and upset by this delay. After all, his daughter is dying. I get it. She doesn't have much time, and Jesus is wasting his time on this woman. On the surface, Jesus' delay seems, I think, a little insensitive. But the delays of life are designed to increase our faith. I mean, you take a Joseph, you throw him in a pit, and then into slavery, and then into prison. And out of that delay, God will give you the prime minister of Egypt and a man of God. When God doesn't move as quickly as you might like, trust him anyway. And what you'll discover is that he'll give you more than we ask. Precisely because of this delay, both Jairus and the woman get far more than they asked for. Be aware that when you go to Jesus for help, you will both give to and get from him far more than you ever bargained for. Nor does the deal often work out the way you expected. I mean, take Jairus. He came to Jesus to cure his dying daughter, but he got far more than that. Okay, well, let's continue on into the thickening plot of the story. Even though he's been told that the little girl's dead, Jesus looks at Jairus and says, I'm coming anyway. We continue on in verse 37. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." Really? Sleeping? Jesus is basically saying here to the people, including Jairus, don't believe what you hear, don't believe what you know, don't believe even what you see, and most of all, don't believe what you think. Instead, trust me. He's saying, Jairus, you believed me when you came to me a few moments ago. Well, keep believing in me now. Here's the point. If God was faithful before, he will be faithful now. Listen, church, circumstances may change around us, but God doesn't. Okay, well, when they finally arrive at Jairus' home, everyone is in mourning for the dead girl. So, of course, they laugh when Jesus says she's asleep. Really? Come on, Jesus. I mean, they know a dead child when they see one. But what a contrast between the despair of the mourners and the hope of Jesus. Don't bother the teacher, they said, if you remember. There's nothing anyone can do now. It is what it is. But Jesus says, don't be afraid. Only believe. They're wailing and they're weeping and they're tearing their hair and they're ripping their clothes in a fit of grief. But Jesus was calm and quiet and serene and in control. Well, the story continues in verse 40. And they laughed at him, but he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the little girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. I mean, of course they're astonished. Jairus came to Jesus for a cure from sickness, not a resurrection from the dead. But Jairus just learned something that we should all know. When you go to Jesus for help, you get much more than you had in mind. But I think it's also important to know that when you go to Jesus for help, you also end up giving to him far more than you expected to give. Jairus came thinking that he would have to trust Jesus just enough to get home, hoping that somehow the child wouldn't die before he arrived. But Jesus demanded far more from him. After Jairus' daughter had died because of the apparent malpractice of the great physician, Jesus looked right into his eyes and he said, trust me. Jesus, you see, was demanding a test of faith far beyond anything Jairus had expected. I mean, for that matter, take the sick woman. She had come to Jesus for healing, but she wanted just to touch and run. She wanted to say, I'm better, and then I'm out of here. But Jesus wouldn't have it that way, which is why he forced her to face up to the fact. You see, she had a somewhat superstitious understanding of Jesus' power. She thought it was the touch that would heal her. She thought his power was manageable. But Jesus made her identify herself so he could say, listen, it's the object of your faith that healed you, and the object is me. And now that you know that fact, you are in a life-transforming relationship with me. I mean, there's all the difference in the world between being a superstitious person who gets bodily healing and a life-transformed follower of Jesus. Listen, if you go to Jesus, he may ask of you far more than you originally planned to give, but he can give to you infinitely more than you dared ask or think, which is why he gives us every reason to trust him. See, as far as Jairus and the disciples are concerned, it's wrong for Jesus to let a little girl die while he deals with a woman with a chronic condition. But we who have read to the end of the story know something that they didn't. We know that for Jesus to raise a girl from the dead or to cure a fever was no different because he has the power over death. Jairus and the disciples couldn't see that. They had no idea. That's because they didn't have all the facts. So often when God seems to be unacceptably delaying his grace and committing malpractice in our life, it's because there is some crucial information that we just don't have yet. Some essential variable that's unavailable to us at the time. Now let me be transparent for a moment with you. When I look at the delays of God in my own life, I realize that a great deal of my angst has been because of pride. You know, I complained to Jesus. Okay, you're the eternal Son of God. You've lived for all eternity and you created the universe, but why would you know any better than I do about how my life should be going? I somehow think that I have enough wisdom or knowledge or experience to be the master of my fate, even though I know that I mess up much too often. You know, in modern Western society, I think we have been taught that nearly everything in life is there to be manipulated for our own ends. But we're not God. And we're not, but we have such delusions of grandeur that our self-righteousness and arrogance sometimes has to be knocked out of our heart by God's delays. Right now, is God delaying something in your life? Are you at a place where you're ready to give up? Are you impatient with him? There may be a crucial factor that you don't have access to. Well, the answer, as with Jairus, is to trust Jesus. Do you think it's odd that when Jesus arrives at Jairus' house, he says that the girl is sleeping? The parallel accounts of the story in Matthew's and Luke's gospel make it clear that Jesus understands she's dead. She's not just mostly dead, she's all dead. Then why does he make that reference to sleep? The answer is in what Jesus does next. Now remember, Jesus sits down beside the girl and he takes her by the hand and he says two things to her. The first is Talitha. Literally it means little girl. But that doesn't get across the sense of what he's saying. This is a pet name. It's a term of endearment. Now, since this is a term that a mother or father would use with their little girl. Probably the best translation really would be something like honey or dear. The second thing Jesus says to her is kuumai, which means arise or get up. Jesus is doing exactly what this child's parents might do on a Sunday morning. He sits down, he takes her hand, and he says, honey, it's time to get up. You know what? She does. Jesus is facing death, the most cruel, relentless enemy of the human race. And such is his power that he holds his child by the hand and gently lifts her right up through it. Honey, get up. Listen, church, when Jesus has you by the hand, death itself is nothing but sleep. But Jesus' words and actions are not just powerful, they're full of compassion too, aren't they? You know, when my kids were a lot smaller, they were scared of the dark. They trembled with fear as they stood at the top of the stairs, unable to move into the darkness of the basement, until they felt my large daddy hand take a hold of their little hand. And I would reassure them that everything was okay and that I wouldn't let anything hurt them. And they would often look up at me and they'd ask that one-word question, promise? You know, with my hand in theirs and my words of reassurance echoing in their ears, we'd make our way into the adventure of the dark basement. But this time, they would walk with confidence knowing that everything was okay because Daddy was with them. Why? Because Daddy is strong. Daddy will take care of me. And I know all that to be true because Daddy promised. And after all, he's holding my hand. My Daddy gives me every reason to trust him. You know what? Jesus is the ultimate parent who has you by the hand and will bring you through the darkest, scariest places. Think about this. The Lord of the cosmos, the one who put the stars into place, he takes you by the hand and he says, honey, it's time to get up. Why would we want to hurry somebody this powerful and this loving and this compassionate who treats us so lovingly? Why would we be impatient with somebody like this? I mean, Jesus holds us by the hand and he takes us through the greatest darkness. What enables him to do this? You know, in his letter to the church in Corinth, 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul says, Christ was crucified in human weaknesses so that we could live in God's power. In other words, Christ became weak so that we can be strong. There is nothing more frightening than for a little child to lose the hand of the parent in a crowd or in the dark. But that's nothing compared with Jesus' own loss. He lost his Father's hand on the cross. He went into the tomb so we could be raised out of it. He lost hold of his Father's hand so we could know that once Jesus has us by the hand, he will never let go. Jesus gives us every reason to trust him, church. In fact, even more so because of his power. That's because his power means that he will not fail. When I read about Jesus walking on water, feeding a multitude with a small amount of food, calming a storm, healing a sickness, it amazes me. But nothing showcases his power like him raising somebody from the dead. I mean, if Jesus could do that, there's nothing impossible with him. I mean, that lost spouse or family member can be saved. That impossible situation in your life can be handled. That incredible need that you think is so great can be met. When I place my problem beside Jesus, it suddenly grows very small. No matter how great it might look in my eyes, it is nothing compared to him. After all, a God who can create a universe from nothing can do anything. A God who can part a sea, rain down manna from heaven, heal a sick body, raise a dead body, and save a lost soul can do anything. It might be that you're looking at an impossible situation right now. You may have lost, you may even be here listening to this video tonight lost, and you know that if you die, you're going to go to hell. Your story does not have to end that way. Come to Jesus and trust him to save you. Believe Jesus. His power means that he will not fail. You might even be out of God's will with a heart that's cold and far away from God. You can come home today, and he'll restore you to a place of closeness and usefulness. Believe Jesus. His power means that he will not fail. I mean, you might have a problem that you can't handle. It's bigger than you are and it's out of control. Guess what? He can handle it. He can cut it down to size. Now, in this story today, we discovered a man without hope, without a cure for his dying daughter. But then something amazing happened. And along the way, not only was the little girl raised from the dead, but Jesus entered Jairus' life in an intimate way. He touched him, and his life was never the same. And you know what? I can relate, because I was without hope, and I was dead in my sins, but then Jesus entered my world, and he took me by the hand, and he said to me, Steve, it's time to wake up. And you know what? My life was never the same. Are you trying to hurry Jesus? Are you impatient without the waiting? Let him take you by the hand. Let him do what he wants to do. He loves you completely. He knows what he's doing. Soon, it'll be time to wake up. And his power means that he will not fail you in your life. Have a great week. You are loved.